Welcome, folks, to the final lesson of our Canadian Expansions unit, First Nations in a Growing Canada. Listen to that lovely, peaceful flute music. Fantastic. So we see some images here. We're going to be looking at the treaty negotiations between the Canadian government and the First Nations, as well as the residential school systems. We see a painting and a photo from these treaty negotiations. I also have a lovely image here. This is of the Vision Quest. If you don't know what that is, that's where a young Aboriginal person would go out in several cultures when they were around 12, 13 years old into the wilderness for several days, trying to have a dream of a certain animal. And when they got back, they would tell people what that animal was, and that would be their new name. I always thought that was really cool, but I wondered what would happen if you were out there for so long and you just didn't dream of having an animal. And eventually, I guess you would just make something up, I guess. But something here perhaps doesn't belong. And yes, Sir John A. Macdonald, his government would be a key part in the establishment of several of these institutions that we'll see were not always so great for the First Nations. But at least he's well dressed here, isn't he? Good-looking fellow. Oh, look, here he is again, but in puppet form. Such a friendly puppet. I'm sure he's got something nice to say.
The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominions speedily as they are fit to change. My mom still thinks I'm cool.
He's got this Scottish banjo. Shouldn't take too long to finish. Oh, I guess it was too long. Yeah, that turned out not to be so nice after all. This is an actual quote from John A. Macdonald. And we talk about assimilation, this idea about one culture absorbing another. And it's often a dirty word these days, but back then that was straight up what they wanted to do. They said we want to assimilate the Indians or the First Nations so that they can't be recognized as their own culture, that they're just like everyone else. So today seen as an awful thing, but they were very open that that's exactly what the government wanted to do. Okay, so looking at the treaties first. Why the numbered treaties? So we looked at the Royal Proclamation recognizing First Nations land rights. You might remember the Pontiac rebellions where the British wanted to stop First Nations from rebelling. That being said, you may recall also that they did not live up to their end of the deal. They did not protect the Aboriginal land rights when the waves of settlers came. But both the Canadian government and First Nations, they saw down in the United States, they were actually having these huge Indian wars, they called them, where they were wholesale slaughtering the First Nations. And there was a lot of violence, a lot dead on both sides, so that neither of them wanted a repeat of that. As we saw, Canada also wanted to build a railroad across the country, but especially in the West, there were still a lot of First Nations, and they were in the way, so the government wanted to clear the way. The First Nations, they were looking to make a deal, because they had lost so much of what they had between smallpox epidemics and other diseases such as the flu and the measles that wiped out millions of people in North and South America. The loss of the food source and source of fur in the bison and beaver, and the increasing European settlement and encroachment on their lands. So they said, please, can you give us some kind of guarantee that we're going to have something? And this is a lovely little medal that was given to a lot of the First Nations negotiators, sort of as a sign of goodwill. But very much, in a sense, you can think of this as, hey, here's a nice shiny object to make you happy because you don't realize what a bad deal you just got. Now that might be a little bit cynical. Not all government negotiators were out to cheat the First Nations, but we'll see that things didn't go so well for them. So this lovely map of Canada shows the different treaties that were negotiated. Yes, that's right. This is why they were called numbered treaties, because they all had numbers. You'll note that some parts of Canada did not have treaties. Some actually were recently negotiated, like in 2018, the governments of BC, Canada, and several First Nations came up with some treaties here, or a treaty. And down here, over in eastern Canada, many of the First Nations had already pretty much cleared out of there. There weren't really too many left, so they weren't looking for treaties to keep the peace right there. But you'll see in Alberta, we have Treaty 7 right here where we are, and Treaty 6 and 8 and little parts of 4 and 10 also cover Alberta. It'd be lovely to go up here into Treaty 10 land. Wouldn't that be fantastic? That's what I'd call a vacation. And so often at sporting events or other public events, you'll hear people say, we acknowledge that these were traditionally the lands of the people of Treaty 7. So yes, even though they did, in a sense, give up the rights to much of the land within there, that's an acknowledgement of the historical wrong and that this was not necessarily a fair deal. And that's why that it's felt that that's a proper thing to do. Okay. So as far as the details of the treaty, so we mentioned Alberta was covered mainly by these three. All of the treaties that were on that map were signed in the last quarter of the 19th century. So they gave access to the government and other settlers much of the land there, but there was also land set aside for the First Nations. It was reserved for them. Reserves or reservations, they're known as. In addition, with the treaties, the members would receive annuities. These are annual or yearly payments. And back then, $5 a year, which is the amount that you would get in Treaty 8, that was a fair amount. You could buy like a fair amount of supplies for that. Nowadays, you know what, I bought a bag of these little flat pretzel crackers, and it was a little more than $5, right? So not really the greatest deal today, but the thing is, legally, it still says $5 a year, so that's what they continue to receive. That's inflation, when the value of the money decreases or the prices increase. In addition to that, it also established healthcare, education, hunting and fishing rights, and farming assistance for the First Nations. Now, if you look at education, a few years ago they actually found the average First Nation student on a reserve got about 77 cents spent on them for every dollar that non-reserve students get. So this education is provided by the federal government, whereas like our education is provided by the provincial. As far as farming assistance, the general idea was that people who had once depended on hunting, like the bison, for food, would transition to farming on their reserves. And this, as we'll see, for several reasons, would prove to be a challenge. Partially because that was culturally, like as you were a First Nations man, you took pride, like part of manhood was hunting. And all of a sudden they give you a shovel and a plow and they say, hey, here you go. It was emasculating, you could say. We have an image here of the Tsuut'ina Reserve. So really if you're a non-First Nations member, a non-band member, you're really not supposed to be hanging around there unless you have business or reason to be there. Okay, we see some photo of the negotiations as well. These could last weeks. And you would get several different bands coming in. So the Treaty 8, for example, or Treaty 7 where we are, those are several different First Nations. It's not like it's only the Blackfoot. We have several groups all coming together, which, as we'll see, will create another problem. Okay, and one of them, perhaps one of the greatest, is the language. So if you have several different groups, they're speaking different languages. And an interpreter might speak several of those, but if you have 8 different First Nations, all with their own language, plus English or French, that's going to be very difficult for everyone to get a fair say. So some of these interpreters were very good, and they also, many had good intentions. They wanted the First Nations to get a fair deal, but the language barrier was a huge challenge. Not only that, but the First Nations, even if they could understand the language, they did not have the same British-style legal system. The idea that I own this land. For many of them, it was that the land is used by whoever needs it. So not only is there the language barrier, but the whole legal jargon that comes up. That was just very confusing. They didn't always know what it was they were agreeing to. They basically, many believe this is just a peace deal, like we're agreeing to have peace. In addition, afterward, many of their lands were not the greatest quality. Like they said, we want you to be farming here, but it was not the ideal farmland. That was reserved for the European settlers that we talked about earlier. But some of this land was later discovered to have very valuable things underneath it, like fossil fuels. After that, then there have been struggles between the different governments saying, hey, First Nations, yeah, that's your land, but we have the right to the resources. So it's been a huge challenge overall. And even for some of them who had a good go of it, who had land, and like the Lubicon Cree, they relied on moose hunting. But when the land outside their reserve was discovered to have fossil fuels, then that wiped out a huge part of the moose habitat outside, reducing the population and forcing them to be dependent on the government for assistance. So just many, many bad breaks. It's just very tragic for the different First Nations groups. Even the well-intentioned European Canadians often ended up leading them to these unfortunate times. Okay, so now if we were in class together, we would actually do a simulation to explore this language barrier, taking on the role of government officials, First Nations bands, and their interpreters, and negotiating those different things we talked about, like the different rights, as well as how much land the First Nations would give up, with the main goal being avoiding military conflict. Because as we've seen from our many rock, paper, scissors wars in class, military conflict is pretty much the last thing you want. All those paper cuts, my goodness, it's ghastly. But that being said, you have that source analysis assignment to do. Eventually, we're coming up to our online quiz, so I don't want to overwhelm you with an additional assignment here. Okay, so with all these different treaties, they needed some form of organization, a kind of common framework, and thus the Indian Act was introduced. Now, we throw a lot of flack toward John A. Macdonald, but he actually wasn't in power when this one came across the table. It was actually Alexander Mackenzie's little time in government. And this Indian Act is still in effect. It's been revised a few times, but it's still there. It's still called the Indian Act, much to the consternation of many First Nations and non-First Nations people. They're saying, we don't call them Indians. They're not Indians. Why is it still called that? So the main goal of this was either assimilate them, as good old John A. wanted to do, or if they wouldn't assimilate, have them die off, give them such horrible conditions that was the case. So it established the different rules for the different bands and Indian status. So who would receive these benefits we talked about, like education or hunting rights. And so the goal was to have as few people with Indian status as possible, because that's like officially getting rid of the Indians, if you want to call them that. And so the thing was, you were not a full citizen, truly, of Canada if you had Indian status. Because yes, you got your treaty benefits, but you could not actually vote in federal elections. Not until 1960 were people with Indian status able to vote. And you could choose to give up your Indian status, but actually very few. In close to 90 years, less than 100 people actually chose to willingly give up their Indian status. It was seen as either the treaty benefits or the pride of the status outweighed voting in Canadian elections. Not only that, but the system was rigged against people having Indian status. So if you were a First Nations woman and you married a white man, you would lose your status. There was no choice about that. If you were a white woman and you married a First Nations man, you did not gain Indian status. And so, wanting to get the assimilation going a little bit faster, John A. Macdonald was now back in power, and he said, hey guys, we're going to have English education in residential schools. This is going to be mandatory. They had some French ones in Quebec, but people, as we'll see, were often sent thousands of kilometers away to these schools. So they're called residential schools because you would actually live in them, like a residence. Some of them were actually located on the reserves themselves, but despite that, you still were not allowed to see your parents until either Christmas holidays or the summer. You might be wondering who this fellow with the hat and the beard is. He's an example of an Indian agent. So not only could you not vote, but as a First Nations person, you were not allowed to leave your reserve without permission as well until 1960. So for a lot of First Nations people, these Indian agents were like a symbol of repression. They were kind of like the Dementors of Azkaban, if you're a Harry Potter fan. And if you're not a Harry Potter fan, I'd recommend you pick up some of those books. I mean, hey, what else have you got going on? Okay, other than, of course, if you're looking after your loved ones. I'm sorry, I apologize wholeheartedly for that. Okay, so we have a permission form. This is an actual form from 1932 for this fellow to go and hunt off the reserve. So you can see here he's got 2 weeks permission to hunt big game. Looks like he is allowed to carry a gun. The thing is, this is very much just like a parolee being allowed to go on visits outside of prison. So pretty much you're being treated like a criminal. You can't just walk around freely like other Canadians could. And yet they were the first people, right, who used to be able to wander far and wide. Tragic. Okay, so a little bit more about residential schools. You will look at residential schools more throughout the rest of your school years. I actually, don't tell anyone this, well, go ahead, tell anyone you want. I actually compiled this presentation from 2 different ones from grade 9, because a lot of the focus is the same. So the government, though, even though they said you have to go to residential schools to the First Nations, if you were a parent and you said, nope, you could go to jail for that, for defying the government. They said, you know what, we don't want to pay for this, though. So they said, hey, churches, you're looking to get new converts, you can go ahead and you can run this. We'll save money. So the Catholic and the Anglican churches and the Lutherans as well, those were the biggest ones. There were some other churches too, but those were really the big ones who ran this. And those churches were happy because this was their chance. They were always looking for new souls to save, right? And so when you were there, you were not allowed to see your own family, even if they lived close, or speak your own language. And we'll see the kinds of punishments that that took place if you did. You were pretty much told that your culture was inferior. You were forced to have your hair cut, which for many was a big sign of dishonor and humiliation. The living conditions also were extremely poor, and maybe this is really relatable now in this age of COVID-19, but with the poor ventilation and people cramped together, 6 to 12% of students died each year. Now, this was a study that the government commissioned in 1906, and so imagine in our school, we have about 700 people. If you had about 6 to 12%, that would be anywhere from about 40 to 80 people dying every year in our school. So pretty much like at its worst, like 3 whole classes of people dying every year. It's just inconceivable to imagine this. And as far as what did the government do about that? They fired the guy who gave this report and just did nothing about it. You know, kind of like look away, just pretend the problem doesn't exist. There was also, very, very tragically, physical and sexual abuse. And so not only did the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, they were coming from a background that did not look at spanking or beating their children. They would often, if their children misbehaved, they would tell them a subtle story, like the fox was being naughty, and thus eventually the bear threw him in the river. Right? So something that's kind of roundabout. But they were certainly not doing what many European Canadians were doing and whacking people with sticks. But that being said, even by the European standards of the day, this abuse was really horrific, just really awful, traumatizing them. And now, like, not every single teacher in the schools was abusing their kids, but it was very, very widespread. And the thing is, even if you weren't, overtly abused, like they weren't actually doing anything to you, being torn away from your family, being told that your culture was inferior, this had a traumatic effect on people nonetheless. So some have argued that, okay, well, one of the good things about it was that they learned skills, they got an education, and some of the First Nations leaders who helped to put an end to this system learned, how to read and write and so on from these schools. That being said, that argument is very much like saying, oh, well, gosh, I was in the dungeon for 30 years, but eventually I found the key in the dungeon. Right, it's not really any excuse or justification for this, right? This education could have been provided without the widespread abuse. So yeah, there were some First Nation students who actually did say, yeah, we had a great experience, we loved it, didn't mind being away from home, but they were really more the exceptions. And when you look overall at First Nation society and the effect these residential schools had, it was largely negative. And because these First Nations, it's not like it was a smooth transition saying, oh yes, we're going to embrace European culture. No, because yeah, sure, they were told that their own culture was no good, but certainly this European culture was not endearing itself to them. I mean, it was beating them, it was abusing them. So they were kind of lost and without a culture to cling to. So it was just very tragic, this overall effect. And when we look today at a lot of the substance abuse issues and the broken families, you can trace back to the older generations of these residential schools. The last of which closed in 1996. So really, it wasn't all that long ago, just about 10 years or so before you were born, that this was happening. Okay, so here are some examples of some of the punishments you could have. And now when we're in class, sometimes I actually, this bottom one, I actually let people volunteer to try this and see what it feels like. But so you fail a test, no food for a day. I mean, people complain about not having enough time to have their snacks. Sorry, I'm not saying you shouldn't get your snacks in your class, but just to show how brutal it is. 4 hours of extra work for those working hard enough or not working hard enough. So really harsh punishments. No water for a day for being disobedient. Maybe you're acting out because you're not hungry, right? For speaking your native language, here you go. No supper, first time. No supper and a beating, second time. And third time, considered disobedience and punished as such. Now this is very ominous, right? Like what does as such mean? Going off by yourself without another student present, because the thing is, some people actually tried to run away. So that was actually a concern they had. And several hours of kneeling alone on a stone floor. So I've had students who've tried this. I promise I didn't make them. I said, you guys want to see what this is like for a few minutes? And people said, yeah, and they kneeled on the floor. And after about 5 minutes, for a bunch of them, they said, this is really uncomfortable. So, I mean, hey, if you want, you can try this on your, if you have a hard kitchen floor or something. See how long it takes to feel a bit of discomfort. Like, don't hurt yourself, but you can see, my goodness, after a few minutes, it's awful. So here's just an example. Phil Fontaine, he was a former chief of the Assembly of First Nations. And so he also was a residential school and survivor, they call them. And now some people say, well, gosh, it's not like, going through a volcano or a tornado. But in a sense, I mean, we look at those numbers, right? Like 6 to 12% dead in some of these places. Not to mention people who have, taken their own lives as a result of the trauma they faced. So in 2008, the federal government actually gave an official apology and compensation, meaning like a cash payout for people who'd been to the residential schools, regardless of the level of trauma that they had faced. Okay, and so we're, of course, not doing the simulation, but that's an examination, one of the darker chapters of Canadian history. So it's something we do examine and you'll look at throughout the years. But do keep it in mind that it really started at this period of history that we've been examining, the late 1800s, but it also went through most of the 20th century, continuing on just like that. And even though, if we go back here just a little bit, people weren't dying at 6 to 12% in the late 1900s, but a lot of the abuse still was continuing. Okay. So thank you very much, folks, and please stay tuned for the Review Kahoot about the Canadian Expansions Unit, as well as our eventual quiz, which will be posted sometime after the Easter break. So I hope you guys have a wonderful Easter, and